The letter came on a quiet Tuesday. The sky was soft with early spring light, the kind that makes everything seem gentler than it is. I had just finished hanging student art around my classroom, paper collages of cherry blossoms and bees, when my phone buzzed. A delivery had arrived at my home in Portland, signed and sealed by Hartwell and Associates. The name alone made my breath hitch. I spent the drive home gripping the steering wheel too tightly, heart drumming against my ribs with a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I had been waiting for that envelope for nearly 3 weeks, not because I wanted what was inside, but because I was terrified of it. Helen, my grandmother, had passed just a month ago, and though I was still wearing her old cardigan like armor and replaying our last conversation in my mind, life had moved forward. Death, I've learned, never slows anything down. The envelope was heavier than I expected. The seal, gold and raised, caught the light in a way that made it feel ancient and sacred. I walked it into my kitchen, sat down at the table we once painted together as a child, and opened it with shaking hands. It didn't begin with legal jargon. It began with her voice, at least her spirit captured in words. To my Emily, whom I love not by blood, but by choice. The rest blurred in my vision. I closed my eyes, holding the paper to my chest. She had left me everything: her home, her land, her investments, even her stake in a charitable fund she'd helped create in her younger years. In total, nearly $4 million in property and assets. It wasn't just the money. It was what the gesture meant. That she had seen me, believed in me, trusted me with something most people only dream of. But at the same time, the weight of it crushed my chest like a boulder. I had never seen myself as someone who would inherit anything. I'm a middle school art teacher. I make enough to live modestly, save a little, and buy acrylics when they're on sale. Helen was always more than a grandmother to me. She was my sanctuary, my moral compass, my fiercest advocate. But she was also the matriarch of a family with complicated lines, and I knew, deeply, that this inheritance would not sit quietly with everyone. I was right. The knock on the door came less than 24 hours later, sharp and urgent. When I opened it, Valerie Montrose stood there, impeccably dressed as always in her tailored cream blazer and heels that clicked against my porch like gavel strikes. My mother-in-law. We had danced an awkward waltz for years. After Ben died, our relationship drifted into civility, punctuated by occasional tension. We had shared grief, but never warmth. And yet I had tried. Good Lord, I had tried. "Emily," she said, smiling without smiling. "May I come in?" She didn't wait for an answer. I stepped aside, watching her take in the space. It still smelled like Helen, jasmine, and cedarwood, and I saw her eyes flick briefly toward the painting on the wall. The one Helen and I had done together one summer, laughing over tea stains and paint smudges. "I suppose you've read it?" she asked, settling into one of my kitchen chairs like she owned it. "I have." She folded her hands on the table. "And you're comfortable with it? With what it implies?" I blinked. It wasn't a surprise, if that's what you mean. Helen and I were close. Valerie's smile hardened. Close, yes, but not family, not by blood. And Helen was known for her sentimentality. I didn't respond. "I expected a more traditional arrangement," she continued. "Something logical. You see, Helen and I had a long history. We shared many of the same philanthropic interests. She once offered to help fund one of my women's initiatives." "She told me about that," I said gently. "She also told me she backed out after she saw how the money was being spent." Her lips thinned. "I see. So she confided in you quite a lot." I nodded. "We had that kind of relationship." Valerie stared at me for a long moment. "Well," she said, standing, "I suppose I'll have to take this to the courts. If Helen wasn't of sound mind, then her decisions can be reconsidered." My hands clenched. "You think she didn't know what she was doing?" "I think grief can cloud judgment. And so can illness. She was forgetful near the end. Erratic. And you, well, you were always there, influencing her, My stomach turned. I was caring for her when no one else did. Exactly, she said with a tight smile, which gives the appearance of control. And that, Emily, is a story any judge will understand. And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for several minutes, not moving, not breathing. Then I walked back into the kitchen and sat in the same chair she had occupied, suddenly aware of how cold everything felt. What followed was a week of silence. And then the ripple. Valerie filed an official petition to contest the will. Word got around quickly in our small social circles. I was asked, politely but firmly, to take a leave of absence from the school while the allegations were under review. Parents murmured in hallways. A few old friends stopped returning texts. I didn't blame them. It's easy to believe that power changes people, that money awakens greed. But no one saw the nights I held Helen's hand through her tremors. No one saw the hours I spent organizing her medications, preparing bland food she could stomach, sitting through her silences when words no longer came easily. I knew I wasn't a perfect person, but I also knew I had loved her fiercely. That should have been enough. One evening, I went up to the attic of Helen's old house. My house now, though it still felt like hers. I found her journals first, then the box. A hand-carved cedar chest with a brass clasp. Inside were dozens of USB drives and envelopes labeled in her handwriting. One envelope simply said, "In case she tries." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a printed letter, a scanned copy of a notarized audio recording, a list of contacts, including her doctors, neighbors, and even a lawyer I'd never met, Maya Torres. Beneath it all was a sticky note. Emily, you once told me that justice was messy but necessary. Here's your mop. Love you, my lion-hearted girl. I couldn't stop crying, but the tears weren't for grief anymore. They were for the clarity, for the knowing, for the fierce, meticulous love that had planned for even this betrayal. Helen had anticipated Valerie's reaction. She had prepared for it. The next day, I called Maya Torres. I told her who I was and why I was calling. There was a pause, and then she said, "I was waiting for this. I promised Helen I'd help if it came to this. I owe her my career. She told me she'd be flying in that weekend, that we would fight this, that I wasn't alone." And for the first time since that letter arrived, I believed her. That night, I went into the garden, the one Helen and I had planted when I was 13. Most of it had grown wild in the last few months. Weeds and thistles and old rose bushes tangled in each other. But as I knelt beside the dirt, I spotted something. A single white crocus. Delicate, unapologetic. I reached down and touched its petals. And then, I started to clear the weeds. Because I realized something then. Helen hadn't left me an inheritance. She had left me a responsibility, and I was going to rise to it. The first time I stepped into a courtroom as the defendant in a legal challenge over the will, I remember the absurdity of it. I wasn't wearing armor or some sleek lawyer suit. I wore the same navy blue dress I'd worn to parent-teacher conferences. My shoes had paint specks near the sole. My hands trembled slightly, but my spine was straight. It wasn't arrogance, it was resolve. I had nothing to hide, but the fear still lingered. Not because I doubted my innocence, but because I knew exactly what Valerie was capable of when her image was on the line. Valerie Montrose had built her life on appearances. She wasn't just Ben's mother. She was a pillar of Portland's high society, president of 3 charity boards, and a regular presence in glossy lifestyle magazines. And now she was sitting across from me, flanked by 2 attorneys, her expression carved from cold marble. This wasn't about love. This wasn't even about money. This was about power, control, legacy. In her mind, I had no right to carry the Hartwell name, let alone the fortune that came with it. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't here to protect the money. I was here to protect Helen's voice, her dignity, her will, in every sense of the word. A week before the hearing, Maya Torres arrived from California. She was smaller than I remembered, with thick curls she barely tamed into a bun, and a voice that carried authority without ever needing to shout. We met at the kitchen table, the same one where Valerie had once told me I wasn't family. Now it was covered in neatly labeled folders, a laptop, a legal pad, and 2 mugs of too strong coffee. Maya flipped through a binder and looked at me. She left everything, in perfect order. I've never seen someone so prepared for war. Helen had compiled audio files, video recordings, and dozens of letters detailing her state of mind, her intentions, and her love for me. She had recorded sessions with her neurologist, updated her will through a verified estate attorney, and even gathered witness statements from friends and neighbors about her interactions with me. Every page I turned was a quiet testimony to how fiercely she had protected me, how much she must have anticipated this very moment. She knew Valerie would fight, I said, scanning a copy of a notarized letter Helen had written. But she also knew I would be afraid. Maya looked up. You're allowed to be afraid, but you don't have to be alone. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without effort. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined. Sunlight filtered in through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The judge was a woman in her 60s, stern but not unkind. I found some comfort in that. Valerie's attorney, Elliot Graham, presented his case with practiced elegance. He painted a portrait of a frail old woman manipulated by a younger caregiver, someone who took advantage of proximity, trust, and declining mental health to secure a financial windfall. His words were like poison wrapped in velvet. I knew the script. I just hadn't expected it to sting so much. She was known to attend school events with the children Emily teaches, he said, his voice solemn. Holiday concerts, pageants, public displays used to bolster emotional dependency. Our client believes this behavior was part of a pattern of undue influence, culminating in a last-minute change to Mrs. Hartwell's will, favoring Emily over blood relatives. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. Because it wasn't funny, it was strategic. These weren't accusations rooted in truth. They were built to raise doubt, and doubt, I'd learned, was often enough to destroy someone. Maya rose to respond, her heels clicking softly as she crossed the floor. We will address each of those points in due time, Your Honor, she said calmly. But I would like to begin with something that cannot be reinterpreted. Mrs. Hartwell's voice. She pulled up a laptop and played a video. The room fell silent. On screen, Helen sat in her garden, the same one I had returned to a week earlier. Her silver hair was pulled back, and she wore her favorite denim shirt, the one she refused to throw out even after the elbows tore. Her voice, though fragile, rang with clarity. I know what I'm doing, she said, looking directly into the camera. And I want Emily to have it. All of it. Not because she's the most qualified to manage millions, but because she's the most qualified to carry forward what matters. She's my family. Blood didn't raise her. Love did. The silence that followed was thick and deep. Over the next hour, Maya unfolded our case like a carefully plotted novel. There were medical evaluations from 3 separate neurologists, each affirming Helen's mental competency. There were letters Helen had written to longtime friends, referencing the will and her belief in my stewardship. There were dated recordings of conversations between Helen and me, laughing, reminiscing, planning. Then came the doorbell camera footage. In the video, Valerie stood on Helen's porch, smiling too widely. Her voice was soft, too soft. You don't need to explain everything to Emily, she said, adjusting her scarf. She's sweet, but she doesn't understand legacy. Just sign this. I'll make sure she gets something. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Valerie's attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. The courtroom was no longer a space of doubt. It had become a mirror, and in it, everyone could see who Valerie really was. Still, Valerie wasn't finished. She had one final move. A surprise witness. Her name was Denise Holloway, a nurse who had assisted with Helen's care in her final months. Denise testified that Helen had frequent moments of confusion, and that she once mistook a neighbor's daughter for Emily. It was shaky, circumstantial, but it stirred enough murmur that I felt my stomach tighten. That is, until Maya began her cross-examination. How long did you work with Mrs. Hartwell? Maya asked. 3 months. Do you know if Mrs. Hartwell had visual impairments? Yes, she wore thick glasses. Were you aware she had prosopagnosia? Face blindness? The nurse blinked. No. Maya turned to the judge. Mrs. Hartwell's diagnosis was well documented. She struggled with facial recognition in crowded or dim environments. What Ms. Holloway describes was not confusion. It was a neurological condition. And yet, despite this, Mrs. Hartwell consistently identified Emily by her voice, her gestures, and her scent. She knew her granddaughter, because love, Your Honor, isn't defined by faces. It's defined by presence. That was the moment everything shifted. The judge called for a brief recess, during which Valerie refused to meet my eyes. She just stared at her phone, fingers trembling. When the court reconvened, the judge's voice was clear and firm. This court finds no credible evidence that Mrs. Hartwell was coerced, manipulated, or incapacitated at the time her will was updated. On the contrary, overwhelming documentation suggests that her intentions were deliberate, long considered, and fully informed. She turned to Valerie. Ms. Montrose, this court strongly advises you to reconsider future legal action. Any further challenges without new evidence may result in sanctions. It was over. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun had dipped behind clouds, and the sky was a muted gold. Maya stood beside me, smiling quietly. You did it, she said. No, I replied. Helen did. The days that followed were a strange blend of peace and turbulence. Valerie's allies in Portland's elite circles began to distance themselves. The story had leaked. Of course it had. A prominent socialite attempting to manipulate a dying woman's will made for delicious gossip. The Portland Chronicle ran the headline, Heir by Heart, Local Teacher Wins Battle Over $1 Million Estate. I hated the attention, but I loved what it represented. Still, Valerie didn't disappear. A week after the ruling, she sent a letter. Not to apologize, but to accuse. She claimed I had humiliated her, that I had destroyed the natural order of their family's legacy. And then, she escalated. She filed a complaint with the school board, alleging that I had used my students to manipulate Helen emotionally. She claimed I'd brought Helen to emotionally charged performances as part of a calculated campaign to sway her. This time, I didn't cry. I didn't even panic. I called Maya. Then, I called my principal. At the emergency review, we presented a video from the previous winter's Christmas pageant. Helen sat in the front row, next to other grandparents, clapping enthusiastically. Valerie appeared at the back of the auditorium, clearly aware of Helen's presence, smiling and chatting with other parents. If these events were inappropriate, Maya said calmly to the board, why didn't Ms. Montrose raise concerns then? Why did she only object after losing her case in court? The board voted unanimously to dismiss the complaint. Valerie was unraveling, but even as her reputation crumbled, I couldn't find satisfaction in her fall. I didn't want her destroyed. I wanted peace. I wanted dignity restored. Not just mine, but Helen's too. One night, I returned to the attic. I opened one of Helen's journals I hadn't yet read. On the last page, she had written, If love is tested in fire, then let mine be proven by what Emily becomes in my absence. I trust her not because she is perfect, but because she is kind. That's when I decided. This inheritance wasn't mine to keep, it was mine to grow. And I knew exactly where to start. There's a quiet kind of grief that follows justice, the kind that doesn't scream or demand, but instead lingers like smoke after a fire. The court case was over, the school board had dismissed the accusations, and Valerie's public reputation had taken a hit I doubted it would recover from. And yet, I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was hollow, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I understood something deeper now. Winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like surviving. The house was mine, the estate, the land, the investments. Every piece of it had passed into my hands as Helen had intended. But I couldn't leave it sitting idle. I couldn't let it become a symbol of division. I had to turn it into something living, something Helen would be proud of. That's when I began building the Helen Hartwell Foundation. It started simply. I spoke to Maya, then a few friends from the school and community centers. The idea was to divide the inheritance equally. Half would go into an educational trust, offering scholarships to students in art and healthcare, the very passions Helen had nurtured in both of us. The other half I committed to transforming Helen's backyard and adjacent land into something entirely new. We called it the Garden of Grace. It wasn't just a garden. It was a reimagining of everything Helen believed in: care, community, and the healing power of nature. The land became a space for after-school programs, weekend gardening workshops, a produce exchange, and a small amphitheater built from reclaimed wood. Children came to plant seeds and paint rocks. Elderly neighbors came to tend herbs and share stories. It was messy and beautiful and full of life. Sometimes, when I walked among the rows of basil, kale, and wildflowers, I imagined Helen there beside me. She would have worn her wide straw hat and carried her favorite pruning shears. She would have laughed at the crooked rows and marveled at how much we managed to grow in such little time. One afternoon, a boy in my class named Malik asked if he could name one of the garden's rose bushes. "Can I call it Miss Helen?" he said shyly. "Because she gave us this, right?" I knelt down beside him, touched the petals, and nodded. "Yes," I said. "She absolutely did." But the garden was only one part of the story. The other part came in the form of a letter. 3 pages, handwritten in a looping script I recognized instantly. Valerie. It arrived almost exactly 1 year after the court ruling. I found it on my porch. No return address, no warning. Just my name written carefully across the front. "Dear Emily," it began, "I owe you an apology." I sat down on the steps to read it, the autumn air curling around my ankles. Her words were unexpected, not just because they were softer, but because they were raw. "My actions were driven by pride and fear," she wrote. "I couldn't see you as family because I was too attached to the illusion that family must look a certain way. I thought legacy came from blood. But I was wrong. Helen saw something I refused to, that you were already carrying forward what she valued most. So," she wrote about her breakdown after the trial, how she'd shut herself away from friends, been asked to step down from 2 boards, and eventually been encouraged by her daughter, Catherine, to start therapy. It was her therapist, she said, who suggested she write the letter. "Not to clear my name," she clarified, "but to clear my conscience." I don't know how long I sat there after finishing. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to protect myself, but another part, the part Helen had raised, understood that people break in different ways, and some of them do try to mend. I didn't write back. Instead, I invited her. It was the following Sunday, on the anniversary of Helen's passing. We were holding a community potluck in the garden, complete with music, storytelling, and a lantern ceremony at dusk. I sent the invitation with no explanation, no expectation. Just a note. "You're welcome to join us." She came. She arrived alone, dressed not in one of her trademark designer suits, but in jeans and a lavender blouse. I watched her walk slowly among the rows of vegetables and flowers. Children darted around her, laughing, uninhibited. For a moment, she looked unsure. Then her eyes found mine. I walked to meet her, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite name. "I wasn't sure I'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure you would either," I replied. We stood in silence for a moment, watching a group of teenagers paint signs for the compost bins. Valerie looked around, her expression unreadable. "She would have loved this," she said finally. "The chaos, the colors." "She's everywhere here," I said. We walked together along the main path until we reached the rose bush Malik had named. Valerie reached out and touched a bloom, her fingers trembling slightly. "I remember when she planted the first one," she said. "She said roses were proof that beauty and thorns could coexist." I nodded. tears gathering at the corners of my eyes. She believed in transformation, that people could choose to grow. Valerie turned to me then. Do you believe I can? I searched her face. The woman I had once feared, once battled in court, now looked older. Not in a way that had to do with age, but in the quiet weight of someone who'd lost something they never expected to lose. I believe you're trying, I said. And that matters. The rest of the day passed in a blur of voices, laughter, and music. At dusk, we lit paper lanterns and released them into the air, each one carrying a wish or memory written by someone in the community. Mine said, "Thank you for teaching me how to fight with grace." Valerie stood beside me as the lanterns rose, her eyes glistening. "I wrote one too," she whispered. "I said thank you for showing me what family really means." In the months that followed, she returned to the garden more than once. Not every week, not even regularly, but she came. Sometimes she brought seeds, other times homemade bread or a book for the reading corner. She never asked for anything. She just helped. Quietly, without fanfare. The community never judged her harshly. Many didn't even know who she was. To them, she was just another volunteer, a woman who sometimes showed up with gardening gloves and asked where she could be useful. One chilly January morning, I found her kneeling near the compost bin, showing a child how to turn the soil. Her hair was tucked into a beanie, her coat stained with mud. She looked up, saw me watching, and smiled. Not the polished smile of social functions, but a real one. Tentative, tired, but real. And I realized then, we were both healing. I still taught art during the week. My students often came to the garden on weekends, and some had their own plots now. We held poetry nights under the twinkling garden lights and invited local musicians to perform by the fire pit. We grew more than vegetables. We grew community and connection and hope. Every once in a while, someone would ask me about the inheritance, what it felt like to win. I never quite knew how to answer, because what I inherited wasn't money. It was a legacy of love, a roadmap for how to live with courage and integrity. Helen hadn't just trusted me to hold her assets, she had trusted me to hold her story, and I had chosen to plant it in the soil. There's a quiet peace in watching things grow, in knowing that grief doesn't have to end in silence, that sometimes it ends in songs sung over garden beds, in second chances, in handwritten letters offered across the distance of hurt and time. I didn't forgive Valerie all at once. Forgiveness, I've learned, is a slow cultivation. But I let it begin. I let her show up. I let her help. And in return, something in me softened. One spring afternoon, as we trimmed herbs for a cooking class, she paused and looked around. "This," she said quietly, "feels like redemption." I smiled. "It feels like Helen." And in that moment, I knew, whatever came next, whatever life planted in our paths, we were finally ready to let it grow. Together. Doi jaila, fan morong jak, biet cho kao chuyen, kojo dai do hisen tu, bo sung mod bien ko, bat ngon ham tao them kao trao, chiu sao kam suk, vamora kanang tiep tuk fat trian series. Fanai dien ra sao part 3, sudung kung fong kach ke chuyen goi, tunhat tunhanvat Emily Hartwell. Extended chapter, Shadows in the Garden, 2,000 words. Narrative continuation with emotional depth and unexpected conflict. It had been a full year since we lit the lanterns over the Garden of Grace. Spring had returned, warmer and lusher than I remembered. The strawberries were already blooming early, and the kids were racing around the tomato vines like bees circling flowers. Valerie still came on quiet Sundays, sometimes alone, sometimes with a book or a cake she'd baked herself. There was peace between us now, not effortless, but earned. Forgiveness had become a language we were both learning to speak. The Helen Hartwell Foundation was growing faster than I'd dreamed. Our scholarship program had helped 17 students in its first year, and the garden now partnered with 3 local schools for their environmental science curriculum. I should have felt proud. Whole, complete. But one morning in early April, a letter arrived that cracked everything open again. It came in a plain white envelope, No return address. No elegant crest this time. Just my name typed on a sticker. Inside was a photocopy of a legal document. I recognized the format immediately. It was a claim to contest Helen's will. Again. But this one didn't come from Valerie. It came from someone I had never heard of. James Hartwell. I read the name over and over, numbness spreading down my spine like frost. According to the letter, James Hartwell was claiming to be Helen's biological grandson, son of her estranged daughter, who had left the family decades ago and never returned. His claim stated that he had recently learned of Helen's passing and her fortune, and that he intended to file suit to reclaim his rightful share of the estate. I dropped the paper. My hands were shaking. Helen had never spoken of another daughter. She'd told me her only child was my late mother, whom she had adopted after marrying young and struggling to have children of her own. There had been a man once, long ago, but Helen rarely talked about her early years. It was part of her mystery, I'd always thought, her right to guard the pain that came before love found her again. But this? This was something else entirely. I called Maya immediately. She arrived within hours, hair half-dried from a rushed shower, and a legal pad already open. "Let's take this apart," she said, placing the letter flat on the kitchen table. "We need to know who he is, where he's coming from, and, most importantly, whether his claim holds any legal ground." Over the next few days, we dug, and what we found was both devastating and illuminating. Helen had, in fact, given birth to a daughter at the age of 18, a child she had placed for adoption during a time when teenage pregnancies were shrouded in shame. Records were sealed, but through connections and court permissions, Maya was able to locate documentation that linked Helen to a young woman named Margot Taylor. That woman, it turned out, had passed away 5 years ago, survived by one son, James Hartwell. The name wasn't a coincidence. He had taken Helen's maiden name after learning of his lineage. It seemed he had only recently uncovered the truth through DNA testing and inheritance tracking services, tools that didn't exist in Helen's lifetime. And now, armed with this paper trail, he was laying legal claim to her estate. "This changes everything," I whispered as Maya closed the file. "Not everything," she corrected. "It doesn't change how Helen loved you or how she raised you, but legally, this could get complicated." I didn't sleep that night. I walked the garden instead, from bed to bed, past the bean trellis and the sculpture corner the students had created. I found myself at Helen's rosebush, the one Malik had named Miss Helen. I knelt beside it and dug my hands into the earth. I wasn't crying, not exactly, but I felt something deeper than sadness, like the foundation beneath me had shifted, like I was standing on soil that had once been fertile and now threatened to collapse. What hurt wasn't that James existed. It was that Helen had never told me, had never spoken his mother's name. What kind of pain had she carried alone, year after year, that even I couldn't reach? The next day, I met James in person. He requested it, through his attorney. Maya agreed on the condition that it be neutral ground, our community garden. I arrived first. Valerie, to my surprise, was already there, waiting near the rosemary bed. She looked at me, concern etched across her face. "I heard," she said softly. "Someone at the courthouse leaked it. You okay?" "I don't know yet," I replied. She hesitated. "Do you want me to leave?" I shook my head. "No. Stay." James arrived 5 minutes later. He was taller than I expected. Late 20s, wore jeans and a navy shirt, his hair tied back. There was something in his face, something faintly familiar, though I couldn't place it. He walked through the gate, looked around, and said quietly, "She did all this?" "With help," I said. "And her memory." He nodded, almost respectfully. Then he turned to me. "I'm not here to cause harm. I just found out too late. I never got to meet her. I didn't even know who she was. And then I read about this place, about the inheritance, the court case, everything, and I couldn't ignore it." I understand, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. We sat down at the wooden benches by the teaching shed. For the first time, I let myself ask the question out loud. Why now? He exhaled. Honestly, it wasn't about the money at first. It was about belonging. I grew up not knowing who I came from, and when I found out it was someone like Helen Hartwell, I guess, I wanted to claim that part of myself. I believed him, or at least, I believed the part of him that wasn't just chasing wealth. Still, the law didn't care about intention. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle brewed in the background like a storm just past the horizon. Maya built our case around the legality of Helen's will and the precedence of intent. James's team filed motions to delay estate disbursement. Journalists hovered again. I was exhausted, and yet, something strange happened in that fragile in-between space. James began volunteering at the garden. It started small, moving mulch, fixing tools, helping with composting. Then came the day he brought his guitar and played for the kids during story hour. He was awkward with them at first, but patient. They loved him. One evening, I found him standing by Helen's rosebush. She would have liked you, I said quietly. He looked down. You think so? I nodded. You're a piece of her story, even if it came late. We stood there for a long time, neither of us moving. Eventually, we reached an agreement. Not in court, but across a garden bed. James withdrew the lawsuit. In exchange, we offered him a board seat on the foundation and a role in expanding our scholarship outreach. He wanted to start a mentorship program for youth aging out of the foster care system, something close to his own heart. We supported it. Together, Valerie donated seed funding for it in Helen's name. In the end, Helen's legacy didn't fracture. It expanded. It reached a grandson she never met, a woman she chose to raise, and a community she inspired to build something enduring. Sometimes, late in the evening, I walk the garden paths alone, hands brushing against the leaves, and I think of Helen, not just as the woman who gave me everything, but as someone who understood that love isn't limited to who we're born to. It's in who we choose, who we nurture, who we grow with, even across generations, even through pain. She knew the truth long before the rest of us caught up. That legacy isn't about bloodlines or balance sheets. It's about what we plant and what we choose to grow from it. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see love and family in a new light, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's your support that helps us bring these powerful, heartfelt stories to life, one chapter at a time. Thank you for being here, and we can't wait to share what's next.